Hello and welcome to Mindscapes, a series of conversations with men and women whose ideas, vision and philosophy define our contemporary world. My guest today manages and is the inspiration behind the Positive Futures Network. He was also the founder and the president of the People-Centered Development Forum. He moved to these alternative areas after a career as a professor at the Harvard School of Management. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. David Korten.
Thanks. Pleasure to be here.
Dr. Korten, sort of the most recent book that I've read of yours, and it isn't the most recent book you've written, has been When Corporations Rule the World. It's ironical because in many of our countries, we begin to feel that maybe if governments were sort of run more like corporations, they would be more efficient. What happens when corporations rule the world? Well, that ethic rules the world.
Yes, we build up a kind of mythology about their efficiency. And of course, it's a very complicated picture, but I think the reality is best captured by going back to the history of the corporation. Of course, here in India, you had a certain amount of experience with the British East India Corporation, which is really the forefather of most of our contemporary corporations. And you begin to realize that the corporation as an institution is designed to concentrate economic power without accountability. And of course, those early corporations, as you well experienced, were created for the purpose not of creating wealth, but rather extracting wealth and then shifting it into the hands of a royalty and a few owners. Now, once you begin to get beneath the surface in the public relations into what's really happening in our contemporary corporate world, you find that to a disturbing extent, not that much has changed. There's a very interesting study that was done in the United States compiling all of the research studies that had been done on costs that corporations pass on to the rest of society from defective products, from workplace accidents, from environmental damage. Added all those up. It turns out that on an annual basis, these costs add up to $2.6 trillion a year. You know, millions, billions, trillions.
You mentioned that they do this without responsibility. There is a responsibility, isn't there, in a sense, to the shareholder to maximize profit?
Yes, that is, to the extent that there is accountability, it is to the shareholders.
And plainly, that is a mechanism that doesn't work, because if they're spending that many $1 trillion wastefully, they aren't even being efficient in what they do.
No, but see, this is the difference between the private interest and the public interest. Because essentially by passing those costs onto the public, they're privatizing the gains from economic activity, but passing the costs on to the larger society. So the gains go through to the shareholders.
To many of us and I hate to use the word developing world, but let's just stay with that phrase for now, there is a sort of an innate discomfiture with the multinational corporation.
Yeah.
What is an alternative to the corporation in the context of a shrinking world, or is the world shrinking because of corporations?
Well, certainly the whole process of economic globalization is very much driven by the corporate agenda, by the corporate interest. You know, the whole agenda of the World Trade Organization has been largely created out of corporate interests. And of course, I should be clear, when I talk about corporation, I'm particularly concerned about the publicly traded limited liability corporation. And part of what's important about that is that, you know, when a corporation is publicly traded, you know, its shares are owned by all sorts of people, but many of them held by mutual funds or retirement funds, some sort of trust fund that's professionally managed. So the real owner, in quotes, of those assets may not even know what company they're actually invested in. and of course have absolutely no idea what the company is doing, what kind of damage it may be doing. Because many investors, you know, are ethical, socially concerned people. They care about the environment, they care about their community, but they have no way to know what their money is actually going for. The only thing that, you know, those of us who have these investments know is what's the annual rate of return we're getting.
Right.
So there's enormous pressure on the money managers to maximize short-term profits. So that's accountability, but it's accountability to a very narrow interest. So when I say, you know, they're unaccountable, it's unaccountable to a larger public interest. Now, of course, you know, we through our governments, we create rules, regulations that say, you know, you can't dump your toxic waste in the river and things like that. But what's been happening through globalization is creating more and more pressures to remove those rules that set boundaries around the public interest, and so the corporation is simply left pressed to follow short-term returns. And it's interesting once you come to understand it, the extent to even which the top corporate managers are in a sense a captive of the system, the structures. Again, they may be very ethical people. They may even be disturbed about what the corporation is doing, but they basically have to keep externalizing costs, buying government officials.
Some of the dramatic, more dramatic examples of what corporations get away with, shall we say?
Well, I would guess, you know, some of the most outrageous currently would be the efforts of the agribusiness companies to monopolize seeds, the release of genetically modified organisms into the environment without adequate testing, but you know, again, under pressure of the shareholders to
maximize profit.
To maximize profit. You know, there's a horrendous tale from you know, earlier in the previous century in the United States, where, you know, the car companies and oil companies bought up the public transit, the trolley system in the U.S., and dismantled it so that everyone would be dependent on automobiles.
So apart from sort of government rules and regulations, which ostensibly in a democracy represent the public interest, what are the mechanisms that we're looking at? Disclosure, that we should be more mindful of where we invest. Is it practical for an everyday investor, in a sense, a small investor, to be able to figure out, to find out?
Yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, we certainly in the United States and Europe have you know, socially screened investment funds and so forth, but it's a very partial kind of solution. You know, I believe we need to look at this in a much larger sense from the standpoint of society, and say, one, to what extent do we really want to see this kind of concentration of economic power? Because, of course, the biggest corporations are getting bigger and bigger. You know, each year the total value of mergers and acquisitions in the world doubles. So the rate of concentration is accelerating enormously. And what this means is that you have, well, if, you know, the current figure, if you rank the world's economies by their GDP and you rank corporations by their sales, and assume that the sales represent the size of an economy internal to the corporation, you find that of the 100 largest economies in the world, 52 of them are corporations. Now, you know, in a democracy, that, you know, that economy is divided up amongst all sorts of people, but within the corporation, essentially the CEO pretty much has the freedom to hire and fire anyone, to open and close plants and communities, absolutely devastating one community, bringing instant prosperity to another, changing product lines and so forth, and there's no recourse by the people affected.
In the forces and flows of capital and money and communications, what is the real alternative to the corporation?
You come back to the question of what is the purpose of an economy. and what kind of society do we want to live in? Now, part of the reality of what's happening to our world with this corporate control and the capitalist system is that we're quite literally destroying life to make money. The World Wildlife Federation recently released a study on the living planet in which they concluded that we have lost 30% of the Earth's life support capacity in the last 25 years. Now, this is the foundation of all real wealth. This is the foundation of our ability to live. And we're destroying it to make money, which is just a number. It has no intrinsic value, whatever. It's just an accounting shit. And then, it's very useful, only because by social convention we all agree to accept it in exchange for things of real value, like our labor or whatever. We're basically organizing a global economy with big corporations to exploit the life of the planet and society, to add up accounting chits for people who already have far more money than they have any use for. So we step back and say, hey, wait a minute, we're 6 billion people on this planet.
Right.
None of us created the living Earth, we inherited it. Arguably, we each have a right to an equal share. Now, we don't have to go all the way to say everything should be absolutely equal, but at least we should be able to agree that every person living on this earth has the right to live, which means the right to access to a means of living, and therefore a right to access to at least enough of the earth's wealth to support themselves. Now we can, we can talk about different standards and so forth. On the other hand, I think it's about having adequate, secure food supply, nutritious food, about having security in one's person, adequate education, a decent shelter, and of course, one of the things we're realizing is that those of us who live in more affluent countries have become used to meeting our basic needs in ways that are grossly extravagant.
You've been a professor of management.
Yes.
At sort of the epitome of management schools globally. You moved away from your work in the mainstream structures of the establishment to look at alternative approaches to management and to development.
Yes.
Beyond the moral argument that it is wrong to exploit for a few, to exploit the earth to the disadvantage of the many. In your work with looking at structures and processes of management, is there a more pragmatic, practical argument to moving away from the large corporations? Because plainly the moral argument is something that is a part of, shall we say, popular, well, not popular, is a part of the conversation, but hasn't been sufficiently powerful enough to motivate our instincts, our natures, our environment, or the sort of the inherent dynamic of globalization. We somehow haven't been able to grasp it and stop it.
Well, I think partly because we are continually fed the propaganda that says, this is creating more wealth that will lift everyone from poverty. And what we're beginning to see now is that's simply not true.
Is there an alternative paradigm to this that we can sort of draw out and structure and define for people who resist this?
Yeah, I mean, the alternative paradigm, I bring it down at, it's sort of almost the more fundamental level, as the choice between an economy designed to make money and an economy designed to live. It's really a question of what do we see as the purpose of society. Is it life? Is that an organizing principle or organizing value? Or is it money? And this is where I think it brings into a spiritual dimension. What do we believe we are? If you go back to classical Newtonian Western science, well, it says everything is just matter, life is an accident, consciousness is an illusion. Therefore, in the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes, there's no foundation for any kind of moral or ethical concern or argument. The only rational thing to do is just to consume, to engage in material gratification. If one goes into some of the deeper spiritual traditions that lead us into the idea that life, the living energy of the cosmos, is the foundation of all existence and all creation, and through that we are all connected, then you have a whole moral sense that we're all part of an incredible exploratory journey of this cosmic energy to discover itself and to become, and we therefore all have an obligation to one another, that God resides in each and every one. And then you look at this world and you say, oh my goodness, what a mess we are making of this creative process. And we say, okay, well, let's step back. Okay, it's nice to have shiny cars and so forth, but how can we organize our way of living on this living planet so that first everyone is able to live a full life, and to have the foundation so that we're not scrambling around competing with one another to get the last grain of rice or wheat to survive, but we have the freedom then to create, to explore our spiritual nature, to explore our relationships, our capacity for cooperation, for the creation of community,
you have done
expression.
a lot of work, in fact, after you moved out of the establishment processes and structures, looking at how development aid, development money could be better managed, more appropriately, more efficiently managed.
Yes.
And you have also suggested that it's not merely a kind of colonial policy of the United States government. It practices what it preaches in many ways in its overseas aid policies as it does within the country itself.
Well, in a sense, the elites in the United States are colonizing the rest of the population, so it's
that's right.
It's not a total break from
that's
colonial
right.
policy.
So what are the sort of the shifts, the structures, the changes in paradigm that you have been looking to cultivate and in the management of aid and development funds?
Yes. Well, one thing that's been happening for a long time in the foreign aid system is promoting the idea that to develop a country must gear its own productive resources to production for export, and that you must develop the facilities and the incentives to attract foreign investment.
Right.
And you're generating these exports in order to earn income to import. Now you take this out to its logical conclusion, and you say we're telling countries that you're going to be best off when all of your productive assets are owned by foreign interests that don't give a darn about whether you live or die, producing, using your resources, your human capacity and skills to produce things to sell to other people, so that you export your food, you export your shoes, you export clothing and electronics and whatever, so that you can then buy everything you consume from abroad. You take it out to that and you say, that is insane. And then you ask, how in the world did anybody ever convince us to buy into this ridiculous argument, which is valid, has a beneficial validity only for the corporations that control the assets and the movement of goods. You come back and you say, well, when we talk about Indian people being poor, what does that mean? Well, it means they don't have secure access to food, they don't have a pair of shoes, they don't have decent clothing, et cetera, et cetera. Is there anything exotic about the technologies involved in these? Not really. I mean, India has had that technology for a very long time. So the real question in terms of authentic development is the question of how can we help one another better organize our own resources to better produce the things that we need for a good life.
To what degree do you feel that in this sort of interdependent world and with the WTO, and in some ways the convergence of national interests in the European economic community. So at one level you see a movement towards autonomy, and yet you see a movement towards a coming together. To what degrees can nations in fact be autonomous and stand up against these pressures and forces? I think it's something that we in India feel, that with the whole sort of emphasis of WTO, with sort of the muscle flexing of the more powerful nations, both with weapons and financial muscle, that we are sort of somewhat reluctantly being drawn into this mesh, a spider's web, as it were. What capacity do nations, in fact, in practical terms, have to resist this?
Yeah. Well, I want to take that in two steps. One, I think most of us that are working on the globalization issue are, we're not isolationists. We're very much internationalists. Planetary civilization emerging. But I sometimes put it in terms of we need to globalize consciousness, sharing, cooperation, but we need to localize our economies. Those need to be more internal. Now, the political question of how does a country withstand these forces, to the extent that we're each clear on what makes a sensible development model, what is realistic, including coming to terms with the fact that on a finite planet, the truth is everybody can't live like Americans because we are living beyond our means in a lifestyle that's totally unsustainable and totally inequitable. Now, it's unfair, yes, but there is no way that everybody in the world is going to copy our lifestyle because the planet will collapse. So, that's part of what we need to get beyond. Now, to the extent that India is clear that, it needs to create a development model for which there is no existing precedent. It's not about going back to living solely with bullocks, but it is integrating in the most advanced and useful of technology to creating a society that can work in balance with itself and with the earth. Okay, now you're under enormous international pressures, Clinton and the WTO head and all this stuff out here. On the other hand, from what I hear, your politicians are just falling all over themselves to adjust your economy, to open it up, to play to the interests of the global corporations and Clinton and so forth. Now, I'm not clear why they're doing that, but it seems to me from India's standpoint it is unconscionable and far beyond what is necessary.
In the sense that a country isn't able anymore, in the context of the internationalism that you referred to be able to function autonomously. It's not just the economy. There's a political imperative, there's a defense security imperative. There is such a sort of interplay of forces that nudge countries and communities frequently into corners with their eyes open sometimes.
Well, if you assume that this globalization process is inevitable, and of course part of the propaganda is that it is inevitable, and that the smart get on board fast because it is competitive and there's only going to be a few winners. As long as you buy into that logic, then there's nothing else to do. If you really come to terms with the fact that this isn't going to work for most people, and you also realize that there really are alternatives, even though there's enormous pressure, but then you also put that in the context that a lot of people around the world are beginning to wake up on these issues. I mean, the protests in Seattle against the WTO, to me, were a real political awakening in the United States. Now, we're still a long ways from sorting out the corruption and bankruptcy of our own political system, but from a sense of political inertia, helplessness, inevitability, just incredible the way people who were involved in that protest in one way or another say, I came alive. You know, an individual can make a difference. I'm not alone. And you're seeing, you know, alliances building between the environmental movement and the labor movement and the churches, and then the youth, who are the ones that really closed down the WTO, and who are seeing that if they don't take a leadership role in creating a very different future, they're not going to have a future. Now, you know, then you've got groups like the International Forum on Globalization that I'm part of and came here at the invitation of Vandana Shiva. You know, these are kinds of alliances among citizen movements around the world that are saying, no, this is not inevitable. There are other choices. And that as people, as human beings with human rights, we have both the right and we have the means, if we choose to exercise it, to recreate these institutions.
Do you have the hope that this movement will prevail, will become a tangible, concrete impetus to action beyond the voice that it already is?
It's something I don't feel I can predict. My message is clear that it's a matter of choice, that it is possible. It's not inevitable that we'll change it. It's also not inevitable that we're going to have a globalized economy. The only thing that's inevitable is if we continue on this current course, human society is going to collapse because the planet will collapse under us and the fabric of human civilization will collapse. But that's not inevitable. It's really kind of a question of, is there intelligent life on Earth? Are we an intelligent species, sufficiently intelligent that we can see what we're doing to ourselves and the planet, change our behavior accordingly?
Are we?
I think, well, we're still very much in the awakening process. But we're seeing, you know, year by year, moment by moment, an incredible increase in the number of people who, one, are more aware of the environmental problem, but also aware of the issues of corporate rule, aware of what economic globalization is really about, what the World Trade Organization is really about the real role that the United States is playing in the world, pushing this process of corporate colonization, and are waking up to the fact it doesn't have to be that way. We have the right and the means to change it. Now, will we get enough critical mass in time? I don't know, but this is, you know, this is where every person on this planet has to ask themselves, where do I want to be in this ultimate struggle for the future of humanity?
Dr. Korten, thank you very much. That's been a great privilege. Thank you.
Thank you.